The blast doors sealed with a hiss just as three men raised their weapons at each other across the cargo bay, and I was standing right in the middle of them with a crate of spare filters in my arms. My name is Nora Bellamy, and I deliver packages for a living on Kesset Station, a rusted ring of metal floating at the edge of nowhere. I am not thin, I am not fast, and I am definitely not the kind of person anyone expects to matter in a room full of armed strangers. But there I was, frozen between a dead translator on the floor and a man who looked ready to start a war because nobody in that room could understand a single word the others were saying. The man in the center wore a long gray coat with silver stitching, and his eyes had the kind of tired anger that comes from losing control of a situation. He knelt beside the body of a thin man in a blue uniform, pressed 2 fingers to the man's neck, and stood up slowly. He said something sharp in common trade, and nobody responded, because half the room did not speak common trade at all. I should have turned around. I should have walked straight back out through the door I had come in, delivered my crate somewhere else, and forgotten I had ever seen any of this. That is what a smart person would have done. But one of the aliens near the far wall, a tall being with gray skin and 4 eyes set in 2 pairs, said something low and threatening in Doskari, a language I only knew because the woman who ran the noodle stall near my apartment used to mutter it under her breath when customers annoyed her. Without thinking, I answered him. Not loudly, not bravely, just quietly enough that only he and the man closest to him could hear. The whole room went still. The man in the gray coat turned to look at me like I had grown a second head. He asked, in common trade, if I understood what the gray-skinned being had just said. I told him yes. I told him the being had said that if nobody explained why they were still waiting, he was going to consider the meeting finished and everyone in it a target. The man's jaw tightened. He asked if I could speak to the being directly. I said I could try. What followed was 15 minutes of the strangest work I have ever done. I stood in the middle of that cargo bay, surrounded by 3 different groups of people who did not trust each other and definitely did not trust the man in the gray coat, and I translated. Doskari to common trade to the clicking, whistling language of the small insectoid trader in the corner, which I only knew a little of, learned from watching cooking programs as a child, because the chef on my favorite show was from that same world. Common trade to the rough, guttural speech of the last group, hulking men with tattoos across their necks, who I recognized as smugglers from the lower ring, speaking a dialect close enough to one my grandmother used that I could follow it without much trouble. By the end of it, nobody was pointing a weapon at anybody else. The deal, whatever it was, moved forward. Crates were exchanged, hands were shaken, or the alien equivalent of hands, and slowly, one by one, the different groups filed out of the cargo bay, until it was just me, the man in the gray coat, and the body of the translator still lying on the floor. He looked at me for a long moment, then he asked my name. I told him, Nora, just Nora, because giving my last name to a stranger who had just watched someone die in front of him did not feel like the safest idea. He introduced himself as Voran Ashek. I recognized the name immediately, and my stomach dropped somewhere near my shoes. Voran Ashek ran half the black market trade routes on this side of the station cluster. People who crossed him disappeared. People who worked for him disappeared too, just less permanently and with better pay first. He asked how many languages I spoke. I told him 5, counting common trade. Doskari, the insectoid trade tongue, the lower ring dialect, and my own. I explained, quickly, that I had grown up in the market district, surrounded by different species my whole life, and that learning to talk to my neighbors had never felt like a skill to me. It had just felt like surviving in a place where everyone was different, and everyone needed to buy bread from the same 3 stalls. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the dead translator, then back at me. He said his last interpreter had been killed 20 minutes before I walked in, shot by someone in that room who thought a translator who could not be controlled was more dangerous than one who could. He said he had a summit in 4 days, a meeting between 5 different factions who barely tolerated each other, and without someone who could speak to all of them, that summit would end in bloodshed before it began. I told him I was sorry for his loss, and that I really did need to get back to my delivery route, because my supervisor at the courier office did not care about dead translators or dangerous men. only about crates arriving on time. He smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. He said my supervisor would understand, because he was about to make a call, and after that call, I would no longer be delivering crates for him. I felt the floor tilt under me in a way that had nothing to do with the station's gravity systems. I told him I was not interested in working for a crime boss, however politely he asked. I told him I had a life, an apartment, a route, a mother 2 levels down who expected me for dinner on Sundays. He listened to all of it without interrupting, which somehow made it worse, because it meant he had already decided none of it would change his mind. He said he was not asking. 2 of his men appeared at the cargo bay door, blocking the only way out. They did not raise weapons. They did not need to. Their presence alone was enough to tell me that walking away was no longer a choice I had been given. Voren said he would pay me more in 1 week than my courier job paid in a year. He said I would have protection, a proper room, better food than the station rations I lived on. He said all of this like it was supposed to make the situation better, like money and comfort could smooth over the fact that I had just been taken from my own life without being asked. I asked him what would happen if I refused anyway. He said that would be a shame, because the 4-eyed being from earlier had already noticed my face very clearly, and a translator who understood 5 languages and then vanished before the summit would raise questions he did not want anyone asking. He said it would be safer for both of us if I simply agreed to help him for the next few days. It did not feel like a request. It felt like the kind of trap that wears a polite voice. I looked at the dead man on the floor one more time. His blue uniform. His still hands. Whatever he had known, whatever languages he had spoken, none of it had saved him when the wrong person in the wrong room decided he was expendable. I understood in that moment that I had 2 options. I could refuse and become just as expendable as he had been, or I could make myself too valuable to lose. I told Voren I would help him with the summit, and nothing more. 4 days, and then I wanted to go home. He agreed, though something in the way he said it told me he did not expect it to end that simply. He turned to his men and gave an order I did not understand, in a language I had never heard before, quick and clipped, and I realized with a cold feeling in my chest that there was a 6th language in that room, one that belonged only to him and the people closest to him, and that I had just stepped into a world where not understanding every conversation could get me killed just as easily as understanding one. They led me out of the cargo bay, past the body that nobody seemed in any hurry to move, and into a hallway I had never walked down in 3 years of making deliveries on this station. Behind me, I heard someone finally call for cleanup, spoken in common trade, flat and businesslike, as if a man's death was just another line on a schedule. I did not know it yet, but that hallway was the last time I would walk anywhere as just a delivery woman. Everything after that belonged to a different life, one where the words in my head were worth more than any crate I had ever carried, and where every sentence I translated could be the difference between a deal and a disaster. I did not sleep that night. I lay on an unfamiliar bunk in a room with a locked door, listening to the hum of engines I did not recognize, and thought about the 4 days ahead of me, and about how easily a life could turn a corner it never asked to turn. At some point past midnight, station time, a woman brought me a tray of food I had not asked for. She did not speak, only set it down and left, but I noticed the way she glanced at the door before closing it behind her, as if she were checking that no one else had seen her linger. I did not touch the food at first. I kept thinking about my mother, 2 levels down, who would wake up in a few hours expecting a message from me, the way she always did. A short line telling her I was fine, that my shift had gone well, that I would see her on Sunday. I had no way to send that message now, and the thought of her waiting for it, then worrying, then calling the courier office and getting nothing but confusion, sat heavier in my chest than almost anything else that had happened that day. I thought about the dead translator too. I did not know his name. Nobody had said it, not once, in all the chaos of that cargo bay. He had simply been a body on the floor, a problem to be stepped around until someone remembered to clean it up. I wondered if he had a mother somewhere too, waiting for a message that would never come. Somewhere near dawn, I finally understood something that would matter more than I could have guessed that first night. Voren Ashek had not chosen me because he respected what I could do. He had chosen me because I was useful, and in his world, Useful people survived exactly as long as their usefulness lasted. I promised myself, lying there in the dark, that I would learn the rules of this new world quickly, faster than anyone expected a tired delivery woman to learn anything, because the alternative was ending up exactly where that translator had ended up, forgotten on a cargo bay floor with nobody bothering to speak my name. The tray of food sat untouched, until the first light of the station's artificial morning began to filter through the narrow window slit above my bunk. Only then did I finally eat, slowly, methodically, because whatever came next, I was going to need my strength for it. Someone tried to bribe me on my second morning, before I had even finished the tea a guard had left outside my door. His name was Callum Reyes, one of the lower ring traders who had been in the cargo bay 2 days earlier, and he found me in a narrow corridor near the kitchens, where I had been told I could walk freely as long as I did not approach the docking bays. He fell into step beside me like we were old friends, smiling in a way that did not match the sharpness in his eyes, and told me he had a proposal. He wanted me to shift a few words during the summit. Nothing dramatic, he said. Just a small change here and there, a number softened, a demand made to sound smaller than it truly was, enough to tilt the deal in his favor without anyone else noticing. He offered me a sum of credits that would have taken me 3 years of courier work to earn. I told him no. He seemed surprised, as if refusing money was not something people in my position were supposed to do. He reminded me that Voron Ashek did not own me. Not really, that I was still free to make choices, and that this was simply one of them. I told him that lying to a room full of armed strangers who already did not trust each other sounded like a very fast way to get myself killed, and that no amount of credits was worth that. He shrugged, said I would regret it eventually, and walked away. I did not mention the conversation to anyone, not because I wanted to protect Callum Reyes, but because I did not yet know who around me could be trusted with information like that. In a place where a translator had been killed simply for existing, I had learned quickly that silence was often safer than honesty. Over the following days, I began to understand the shape of the organization I had fallen into. Voron Ashek did not deal in violence for its own sake, though violence was never far from any conversation. He dealt in salvage, mostly technology recovered from wrecks left over from a war that had ended before I was born, pieces of old warships and abandoned stations that different factions wanted for different reasons. Some wanted weapons, some wanted the metal itself, rare and difficult to produce anymore. Some wanted secrets buried in old data cores that nobody had been able to translate, not because the language was lost, but because so few people bothered to learn languages that were not immediately useful to them. That last detail was the reason Voron valued me as much as he did. Most traders on the station spoke only common trade, and expected everyone else to meet them there. I had never had that luxury. Growing up in the market district meant learning to speak to my neighbors on their terms, not mine, because the noodle stall owner did not care that common trade was easier for me, and the tailor down the row did not slow down his speech just because I was a child struggling to keep up. I had learned out of necessity, the same way I had learned to carry heavy crates and navigate crowded corridors, simply because that was the life I had been given. Voron began bringing me into smaller meetings, testing me the way a person tests a tool, before trusting it with something important. I sat in on negotiations over salvage rights, disputes between traders who spoke different dialects of the same language, and somehow still managed to misunderstand each other, and slow, careful conversations with buyers who wanted assurances that whatever they were purchasing had not been stolen from someone dangerous enough to come looking for it later. I made mistakes, of course I did. In my first real negotiation without Voron standing beside me, I translated a phrase from the insectoid trade tongue slightly wrong, turning what was meant as a polite refusal into something that sounded closer to an insult. The being across the table stood so fast, his chair clattered backward, and for a moment, I thought I had ended the deal, and possibly my own usefulness in the same breath. I apologized immediately, in his own language, explaining my error as clearly and humbly as I could. He studied me for a long moment, then sat back down, muttering something about how at least I had tried, unlike the last 3 humans who had simply repeated themselves louder in common trade until he gave up and left. That small failure taught me more than any of my successes had. Words carried weight in ways that went beyond their simple meaning. A phrase that sounded neutral in one language could sound like a challenge in another. A gesture that meant respect in the lower ring dialect could mean something closer to mockery among the Doskari. I began keeping notes, small scraps of paper I hid in my room, recording not just words but the feelings behind them, the customs that shaped how those words were meant to be received. Vorin noticed the notes one evening when he came to collect me for a late meeting and found me hunched over them at my small desk. He did not say anything at first, just picked one up and studied my handwriting, the careful lists of phrases and their double meanings. He asked how long I had been doing this. I told him since my second day, because I refused to make the same mistake twice if I could help it. He was quiet for a moment, then said something I did not expect. He said his last translator had never once kept notes, had relied entirely on memory and instinct, and that instinct alone was probably part of why he had ended up dead. He said careful people lasted longer in this line of work than confident ones. It was not exactly a compliment, but it was the closest thing to one he had given me since the cargo bay. Word of my skills began to spread faster than I liked. Traders who had never met me started requesting my presence at meetings that had nothing to do with the summit Vorin had originally taken me for. A group of engineers wanted help decoding old data logs, written in a dead dialect nobody else on the station could read. A merchant family wanted me present during a dispute with a supplier because they no longer trusted their usual translator, who they suspected had been quietly working for the other side. Vorin allowed some of these requests and refused others, always with a calculation behind his decision that I did not fully understand until later. He was not simply protecting me out of concern, he was protecting his investment, making sure that whatever value I had did not spread so thin or so wide that someone else could simply offer me more and take me away from him entirely. I asked him once, during a quiet moment between meetings, if he was worried someone would try to take me the way he had taken me from my courier route. He looked at me for a long time before answering. He said everyone in his line of work worried about that, and that the smart ones worried about it before it happened rather than after. He said the four-eyed being from the cargo bay, the Doskari trader named Ilvek Das, had already made 2 inquiries about hiring me directly, offering more than Vorin was currently paying me. He said he had refused both times, not entirely for my sake, but because losing me now, during the lead-up to the summit, would look like weakness to every faction watching. I did not know how to feel about being valuable enough to fight over and expendable enough to be discussed so plainly in front of me in the same conversation. It was a strange kind of importance, one that came with no real safety attached to it. The bribe attempt from Callum Reyes was not the last. A week into my new life, another trader approached me, this one more direct than Callum had been, offering not credits but something closer to a threat wrapped in polite language. He suggested that my family, my mother, 2 levels down, might benefit from a friendly visit, a reminder that loyalty in this world extended beyond the person standing in front of you. That conversation frightened me in a way the first one had not. I went straight to Vorin, breaking my earlier decision to keep such things to myself, because a threat against my mother was not something I was willing to gamble on staying quiet about. Vorin's reaction told me something important about the man I was now working for. He did not simply nod and move on. He asked for a name, a description, a time and place, and when I gave him everything I could remember, he left the room immediately, speaking quickly into a small communicator, in that 6th language I still did not understand. I never saw the traitor who had threatened my mother again. Nobody told me what happened to him, and I did not ask, because some part of me understood that the answer would not make me feel better, only more aware of exactly how far the world I had fallen into was willing to go to protect what it considered its own. That night, for the first time since the cargo bay, I allowed myself to admit that I was afraid, not just of the aliens and traitors and shifting loyalties surrounding me, but of Vorin Ashik himself, of what it meant that a man capable of making a threat against my mother simply disappear could just as easily decide, one day, that I had become more trouble than I was worth. 2 days after the traitor disappeared, Vorin called me into a room I had not seen before, small and windowless, with a single long table covered in old data slates and pieces of salvaged metal. He wanted me to look at something before the summit, he said, something that had been recovered from a wreck deep in the outer debris field, a data core written in a script none of his usual contacts could identify. I sat down across from him and studied the slate he handed me. The symbols were unfamiliar at first, angular and tightly packed, but as I traced them with my eyes, something in the back of my mind stirred. My grandmother, before she passed, used to keep old books written in a language she called her mother tongue, a dialect so rare that even other lower ring traders struggled to place it. I had only ever seen a handful of pages, tucked away in a box she kept beneath her bed, but the shape of certain letters here matched what I remembered of those pages closely enough to make my pulse quicken. I told Voren I recognized part of it, though not all, and that I would need more time and possibly access to whatever remained of my grandmother's old books, still stored somewhere in my mother's apartment, to translate it properly. He studied me carefully, weighing whether I was telling the truth or simply trying to buy myself an excuse to leave the ship. I understood his suspicion. Trust between us was still a fragile, untested thing. He agreed to send someone to retrieve the books, under guard, rather than allowing me to go myself. I did not argue. 2 days later, a crate arrived containing the small collection my grandmother had left behind, and I spent an entire night comparing her careful, faded handwriting to the symbols on the data core, slowly piecing together fragments of a language that had nearly died with her. What I found in that data core was not a weapon, not coordinates to some hidden fortune, but something stranger. It was a record, a personal account written by someone who had lived through the war that left this whole region of space scattered with wreckage. The writer described watching their home destroyed, described fleeing with nothing but what they could carry, described the long, slow work of rebuilding a life among strangers who did not speak their language and did not care to learn it. Reading those words felt uncomfortably close to something I recognized in myself, though our circumstances could not have been more different. I brought my findings to Voren the next morning, more shaken than I expected to be. I told him what the core contained, and watched his expression shift from calculation to something quieter, almost thoughtful, as I explained the story hidden inside those old symbols. He was silent for a long moment before telling me that the buyers interested in that particular data core had assumed it contained old military codes, valuable for their strategic worth. He said knowing the truth changed nothing about the deal itself, but that it changed something about how he intended to handle the seller, an old woman living in the lower levels who had no idea what she had actually been sitting on all these years. He said he would make sure she was paid fairly, regardless of what the buyers were told. It was a small thing, barely a flicker of decency in a business built on much darker foundations, but it told me something important about the man I had been forced to work for. He was not cruel simply for the sake of cruelty. He made hard choices because his world demanded them. But he was not entirely deaf to the difference between profit and exploitation, even if he rarely let that distinction slow him down. That evening, as the summit drew closer, I found myself standing at the narrow window slit in my room, looking out at the slow drift of station traffic beyond the reinforced glass. I thought about the writer of that data core, about my grandmother's careful handwriting, about all the small pieces of language that outlived the people who first spoke them. I thought about how strange it was that the very thing that had gotten me taken from my old life, my ability to understand people different from myself, was also the thing now keeping me useful enough to stay alive. I did not know yet whether that would be enough to see me through what was coming. But for the first time since the cargo bay, I allowed myself to feel something close to purpose, rather than simple fear. The summit was 3 days away, and I was beginning to understand that surviving it would take more than knowing the right words. It would take knowing exactly who around me could be trusted, and so far, the answer to that question was almost nobody at all. The cargo hauler jolted sideways so hard, I dropped the supply crate I was carrying, and by the time I looked up, 3 armed men had already blocked both ends of the corridor. I had been sent alone that morning, against Voren's usual caution, to collect a shipment of parts from a docking bay on the far side of the station. He had been pulled into an urgent call about the summit and trusted his 2 guards to escort me instead. Those guards were now nowhere to be seen, and I had a sinking feeling that their absence was not an accident. The men closing in on me wore no faction markings I recognized, which told me they belonged to someone careful enough to keep their identity hidden. One of them, broad-shouldered with a scar cutting through his eyebrow, stepped forward and spoke in a rough dialect I placed almost instantly as belonging to the Outer Ring settlements, a group known for selling their services to whoever paid the most and asked the fewest questions. He told me, in his own language, that I would be coming with them quietly, and that resisting would only make things worse for me. My heart was pounding hard enough that I could feel it in my throat, but somewhere underneath the fear, a colder, steadier part of my mind was already working. I understood, in that instant, that these men had not been sent to hurt me. If someone wanted me dead, they would have simply killed me the moment the corridor sealed. They wanted me alive and cooperative, which meant I still had leverage, even standing alone against 3 armed strangers. I answered him in the Outer Ring dialect, deliberately slow and formal, using the structure my grandmother had taught me for addressing someone with authority, a style meant to show respect while also asserting your own standing. I told him that taking me by force, without proper challenge, would violate the old codes his own people still claimed to honor, codes about how disputes between rival crews were meant to be settled. The scarred man's expression flickered with surprise, quickly hidden but not quickly enough. I had gambled that a group operating outside official channels, made up of Outer Ring mercenaries rather than polished station enforcers, might still hold on to older traditions, the kind that mattered more in the settlements where they came from than they did here on Kesset Station. It was a thin thread to pull, but it was the only one I had. I told him that if his employer wanted me, the honorable path was a formal challenge to whoever currently held my contract, not a corridor ambush against an unarmed woman. I reminded him, carefully, that Outer Ring crews who broke their own codes found it difficult to find work afterward, because no one trusted a crew willing to abandon the rules that made their word worth anything at all. It was a risk built on very little actual knowledge, more instinct and memory than certainty, but I watched it land. The scarred man exchanged a look with the 2 others, and for a long, tense moment, none of them moved. Then the shortest of the 3 men, standing slightly behind the others, said something quiet in a language I did not fully understand, but the tone was unmistakable, doubt creeping into what had clearly been a simple, straightforward job before I opened my mouth, and complicated it with rules he probably had not thought about in years. I pressed the advantage before it could slip away. I told them plainly that Voran Ashek was already aware I had left the docking bay and would notice quickly if I did not return on schedule, and that whoever had sent them would gain far more from a formal challenge, properly announced, than from a botched grab that would only make Voran more careful and harder to move against in the future. The scarred man studied me for a long moment, clearly weighing his orders against the very real possibility that I was right, that grabbing me quietly would only buy his employer a short-term gain, while destroying any future chance of dealing with Voran through more legitimate channels. Finally, he lowered his weapon slightly and told me they would relay a message, that this was not over, but that today was not the day either. I did not move until all 3 of them had backed away and disappeared around the far corner of the corridor. Only then did my legs finally give out, and I sank down against the cold metal wall, breathing hard, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold on to the crate I had somehow managed to keep grip of through the entire encounter. I do not know how long I sat there before Voran found me. He came around the corner at a near run, 2 fresh guards behind him, and the look on his face when he saw me sitting alone and unharmed was something I had not seen from him before, somewhere between relief and disbelief. He asked what had happened, and I told him everything, as calmly as I could manage with my voice still unsteady. I told him about the ambush, about the Outer Ring dialect, about the codes I had gambled on remembering correctly from my grandmother's old stories. I told him about the formal challenge I had demanded in place of a kidnapping, and watched his expression shift as he understood exactly what I had done. He was quiet for a long moment, studying me, the way he might study a data core he had not expected to be worth anything, only to discover it held something far more valuable than he had realized. He said most people, faced with 3 armed men in an empty corridor, either froze or begged. He said very few people thought clearly enough, in that kind of fear, to turn an enemy's own traditions against them. I told him I had not felt clear at all. I told him I had been terrified the entire time, and that the only reason I had spoken instead of freezing was because staying silent felt like certain death, while speaking at least gave me a chance. He helped me to my feet, and for the walk back to his ship, he said very little, though I noticed he stayed closer to my side than usual, and that his guards flanked me in a formation that felt less like protecting an asset and more like protecting a person. That evening, he called a meeting with several of his most trusted people, and for the first time, he asked me to sit at the table rather than simply standing nearby, ready to translate whenever he needed me. He wanted my read on who might have sent the outer ring crew, and why. I told him my honest guess, based on the little the scarred man had let slip, was that whoever had ordered the ambush wanted me removed specifically before the summit, not killed, but taken out of Voron's reach entirely, so that he would arrive without a reliable translator and be forced to negotiate blind, or worse, rely on someone planted by a rival faction pretending to help. Voron's expression darkened as he considered this. He asked which of the 5 factions attending the summit would benefit most from him walking in without me. I thought carefully before answering. Ilvek Doss, the four-eyed Doskari trader who had already approached Voron twice about hiring me directly, came to mind first, but something about that felt too obvious, too easy to trace back to him if things went wrong. I suggested instead that we should be looking at someone quieter, someone who had shown no obvious interest in me at all, precisely because true interest would be the last thing they wanted anyone to notice. One of Voron's lieutenants, a sharp-eyed woman named Delia Voss who rarely spoke unless she had something worth saying, agreed with my assessment. She pointed out that Callum Reyes, the trader who had tried to bribe me on my second day, had gone unusually quiet in the days since I refused him, when a man like Callum typically could not resist trying at least twice before giving up on an opportunity. Voron considered this for a long time, turning it over the way he seemed to turn over every piece of information before acting on it. He said he would look into Callum Reyes quietly, without tipping his hand, and that in the meantime, I would not be leaving the ship alone again before the summit, regardless of how urgent any call might seem. I did not argue. The fear from the corridor still sat heavy in my chest, and the idea of walking anywhere alone again, even somewhere as familiar as the docking bays I had once navigated freely as a courier, felt like inviting the same danger back a second time. Later that night, after the meeting ended and most of the ship had gone quiet, Voron found me still awake, sitting near the small window slit in my room, staring out at the drifting lights of station traffic. He did not say much at first, simply stood in the doorway for a moment, before stepping inside and sitting across from me. He told me that in all his years running this kind of business, he had lost more people to overconfidence than to actual danger, people who believed their skills made them untouchable, right up until the moment those skills failed them. He said what I had done in that corridor was different, not overconfidence, but careful, desperate thinking under pressure, and that it was rarer than most people realized. I asked him, quietly, if he had ever been that afraid, standing alone against people who wanted to take something from him. He was silent for a long moment before answering, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost some of its usual sharp control. He told me a story I had not expected, about the early years of his career, long before he controlled anything worth controlling, when he had been captured by a rival crew and held for 3 days before managing to talk his way free, using nothing but careful words, and a bluff he was not entirely certain would work. He said he understood, better than most, exactly what I had gone through in that corridor, because he had lived through something close enough to know how much courage it actually took, even when it did not feel like courage at the time. It was the most he had ever told me about himself, and something about hearing it eased a small part of the fear still tangled up in my chest. We sat together in silence for a while after that, not quite friends, not quite anything with an easy name, but something had shifted between us in that corridor, and in the quiet conversation that followed it, something neither of us said out loud, but both of us seemed to feel. The following morning, Delia Voss found me in the small kitchen area near my room, pouring myself a cup of the bitter station tea I had grown almost fond of during my short time on the ship. She sat across from me without asking, which I had learned was simply her way, direct and unbothered by the usual formalities other members of Voron's crew observed around me. She told me she had spent the night digging through old records, trying to trace any connection between Callum Reyes and the outer ring crew that had ambushed me. She had found nothing definitive, No clean line linking him directly to the scarred man or his companions, but she had found something else. A pattern of small, careful payments moving through accounts that did not match Callum's usual trading activity. Money going out, not coming in amounts too small to draw attention on their own, but too regular to be coincidence. I asked her what she thought it meant. She said it meant someone was paying Callum Reyes to stay quiet, or to keep his hands visibly clean, while someone else did the actual work of trying to remove me from the board. She said in her experience, the people who set up plans like this rarely acted alone, and rarely showed their own faces until the very last moment, when the plan was too far along to stop. I asked if she had told Voren yet. She said she had, early that morning, before he left for a final round of preparations ahead of the summit. She said he had taken the news quietly, the way he took most difficult news, filing it away rather than reacting immediately, which she warned me was sometimes more concerning than an open display of anger, because it meant he was already 3 steps ahead in planning a response neither of us would see coming until it happened. I spent the rest of that morning going over my notes one final time, reviewing the phrases and customs I had carefully gathered since my first day, preparing myself as thoroughly as I could for the 5 different factions who would be sitting across from each other in less than a day. I thought about Ilvek Doss and his careful, formal Doskari speech patterns. I thought about the insectoid trader, whose language I had nearly insulted him in during my first solo negotiation. I thought about the lower ring dialect, close enough to my grandmother's tongue that I sometimes forgot it was not quite the same language at all, small differences hiding beneath a familiar surface. Around midday, one of Voren's younger crew members, a nervous man named Peter Ashworth who mostly handled communications, knocked on my door and told me Voren wanted to see me in the meeting room immediately. Something in his tone told me this was not simply another preparation session. When I arrived, Voren was standing over a data slate, his expression tight in a way I had come to recognize as genuine concern, rather than his usual calculated calm. He told me Callum Reyes had disappeared sometime overnight, his quarters empty, his usual haunts checked and found abandoned, as if he had known someone was closing in on him and had chosen to vanish before that happened. I asked if this meant the threat against me was gone. Voren shook his head slowly. He said a disappearance like this usually meant the opposite, that someone had either warned Callum to run before he could be questioned, or that Callum himself had been the one giving the warnings all along, working for someone patient enough to let him take the fall if his part in the plan was ever discovered. Either way, whoever was truly behind the ambush in the corridor was still out there, still unaccounted for, and now had one less loose thread connecting back to them. He told me the summit would proceed exactly as planned, because canceling now, at the first sign of trouble, would only confirm to everyone watching that Voren Ashek could be destabilized by pressure applied through his translator. He said appearing weak now would invite far more danger than facing whatever was coming directly. I understood his reasoning, even as it did nothing to calm the tight knot of anxiety sitting in my stomach. I asked him what he needed from me, specifically, to make sure tomorrow went as smoothly as possible. He was quiet for a moment before answering, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight I had not heard from him before. He said he needed me to trust him completely during the summit, to follow his lead even in moments where his instructions might not make immediate sense, because he suspected, based on everything Delia had uncovered, and everything I had guessed about the timing of the ambush, that whatever was planned against him would happen during the summit itself, when every faction was in the same room, and chaos would be easiest to hide behind. I told him I did trust him, more than I had expected to admit even to myself only 3 days earlier. It surprised me, saying it out loud, how true it felt after everything that had happened between the cargo bay and the corridor, and the quiet conversation the night before. He nodded once, accepting the answer without dwelling on it, though something in his posture eased slightly, as if hearing it mattered more to him than he was willing to show. The rest of that day passed in careful, deliberate preparation. Delia walked me through security measures planned for the summit room, exits I should know, signals Voren's people would use if something went wrong. Peter Ashworth showed me a small communicator disguised as a simple bracelet, explaining quietly that if I pressed it twice in quick succession, it would alert every member of Voren's crew stationed nearby, without alerting anyone else in the room to what I had done. I practiced the gesture until it felt natural, a small twist of my wrist that could mean the difference between safety and disaster, hidden in plain sight, the same way so much of this new life had turned out to be built on things hidden in plain sight, meanings layered beneath meanings, danger wrapped in politeness, and now, perhaps, safety wrapped in something as simple as jewelry. That night, sleep came slowly and unevenly, broken by half-formed dreams of corridors that never ended, and voices speaking in languages I almost, but not quite, understood. When I finally woke, station morning had already begun, and somewhere beyond my door, I could hear the quiet, purposeful sounds of Voron's crew, preparing for the day that would determine far more than any of us fully understood yet. The summit was one day away, and whoever had sent those 3 men to take me was still out there, still planning, still waiting for their next opportunity. I understood now, more clearly than before, that surviving the coming days would require more than knowledge of 5 languages. It would require understanding the 6th language too, the quiet, unspoken one made of loyalty, suspicion, and the fragile trust building slowly between myself and a man I still was not entirely sure I could trust completely. The summit room fell silent the moment Ilvek Das stood up and accused Voron Ashek of arriving without proper protection, and I felt every pair of eyes in the room shift toward me at once. We had barely been seated for 10 minutes. 5 factions, 5 sets of representatives, arranged around a wide circular table, designed, according to Delia, to avoid giving any single group a position of dominance. Ilvek Das sat directly across from us, his 4 eyes fixed on me, with an intensity that made the small bracelet on my wrist feel suddenly heavier than it should have. He spoke in formal Doskari, the dialect reserved for serious accusations, and told the room that a translator who had already survived 1 assassination attempt against the previous interpreter, and 1 attempted abduction just days before this very summit, could not be trusted to remain neutral. He suggested, not quite directly but clearly enough for everyone to understand his meaning, that perhaps I had already been compromised by 1 faction or another, and that anything I translated from this point forward should be treated with suspicion. I felt my pulse quicken, but I kept my expression as calm as I could manage, remembering everything Voron had told me the night before about trusting his lead, even when his instructions did not immediately make sense. Voron did not respond right away. Instead, he turned to me and asked, in common trade, loudly enough for the whole table to hear, whether I had ever accepted payment or favor from any faction represented in this room. I answered honestly, in common trade first, then repeated the same answer in Doskari for Ilvek Das directly, so there could be no confusion or accusation of selective translation. I told them about Callum Reyes and his bribe, which I had refused. I told them about the threat against my mother, which I had reported immediately rather than concealing. I did not mention the ambush in detail, since Voron had instructed me the night before to let him control how much of that information reached the table, but I confirmed that an attempt had been made to remove me before this summit, and that I had resisted it without assistance. The insectoid trader in the corner, whose clicking language I had nearly insulted him in weeks earlier, spoke up unexpectedly, translating his own words into halting common trade before I could even begin. He said, in his careful way, that a translator willing to admit her own vulnerabilities openly, in front of a room full of strangers, seemed far more trustworthy to him than one who claimed to have faced no pressure at all. Ilvek Das did not look satisfied, but he sat back down, and the tension in the room eased slightly, though it did not disappear entirely. I understood, watching his 4 eyes narrow slightly as he studied me, that this accusation had not simply been a spontaneous concern. Someone had wanted this exact moment to happen, wanted doubt planted in the room before real negotiations even began. The negotiations themselves moved slowly over the following hours, each faction pushing for advantage in the division of salvage rights across 3 separate debris fields, each claim tangled up in old grievances that had little to do with the actual technology being discussed. I translated carefully, phrase by phrase, watching not just the words but the reactions around the table. The way Ilvek Das's posture shifted whenever the outer ring settlements were mentioned, the way the lower ring representatives grew quiet whenever anyone brought up territory close to what remained of their original home before the war. Around the midpoint of the summit, Peter Ashworth slipped into the room quietly and passed a folded note to Delia, who read it with a carefully controlled expression before passing it, just as quietly, to Voren. I watched him read it without any visible reaction, though something in the way his jaw tightened told me the news was not good. He did not share the contents of the note with the table, but a few minutes later, he asked for a short recess, citing the need to review updated salvage coordinates before continuing. The moment we stepped into the small side room reserved for his party, he told me and Delia what the note contained. Peter's contacts had confirmed that Callum Reyes had been found, not hiding as Voren had assumed, but dead, his body discovered in an abandoned maintenance corridor several levels below the docking bays, killed sometime in the last 2 days. Whoever had used him to move quiet payments and manage the outer ring crew had apparently decided he had become a liability once his disappearance drew too much attention. I felt a cold weight settle in my stomach. Whoever was behind this had not hesitated to eliminate someone working for them the moment that person became inconvenient, which told me they would show no more hesitation eliminating me, or Voren, if the summit did not unfold the way they wanted. Delia asked the question I had been afraid to ask myself. If Callum Reyes was dead, who had been managing the outer ring crew since his disappearance, and were they still in this room, sitting at that very table, waiting for the right moment to act? Voren was quiet for a long moment, turning the note over in his hands, as though the answer might be written somewhere on the paper itself. Then he asked me something I had not expected. He asked if I had noticed anything unusual in the way any of the representatives had spoken during the first half of the summit. Any word choice, any phrase, that felt slightly wrong or out of place for the language they were supposedly native to. I thought back carefully over every exchange, replaying conversations in my mind, the way I had trained myself to do since my very first mistake with the insectoid trader. Most of the speech patterns had matched what I expected. Formal Doskari from Ilvek Dos, careful halting common trade from the insectoid representative, the rough cadence of the outer ring dialect from the mercenary faction's chosen speaker. But one exchange nagged at me, something small I had brushed past without fully registering it at the time. The representative from the lower ring settlements, a quiet woman, who had introduced herself simply as Mara, had used a phrase early in the negotiations that did not quite match the dialect she claimed to speak. It was subtle, a small grammatical structure borrowed from a different, related dialect, the kind of mistake someone might make if they had learned the language secondhand rather than growing up speaking it, the way I myself had learned languages that were not originally my own. I explained this to Voren and Delia as clearly as I could, though I admitted I was not entirely certain what it meant. It could simply be a regional variation I was not familiar with. Lower ring dialects shifted slightly from settlement to settlement, and I had no way of knowing every variation that existed. Voren considered this for a long moment before telling us something that made the pieces suddenly click into place with uncomfortable clarity. He said Mara had only joined the lower ring delegation 2 months earlier, replacing a representative who had held the position for over a decade before suddenly stepping down for reasons that had never been fully explained at the time. Delia's expression sharpened. She said 2 months was exactly around the time the quiet payments through Callum Reyes had begun, according to the records she had traced. It was not proof, not yet, but it was enough of a thread to pull, and we were quickly running out of time before the recess ended, and we would be expected back at the table. Voren asked me directly whether I believed Mara was working against him, using her position within the lower ring delegation as cover for something far more dangerous than simple trade negotiations. I told him I could not be certain, but that the pattern fit too neatly to ignore, and that if I was right, whatever she was planning would likely happen soon, probably before the summit concluded, while every faction remained gathered in one room and any resulting chaos could be blamed on old rivalries rather than a single hidden hand pulling strings behind the scenes. He asked what I would do if I were in his position. The question surprised me. In all my time working for him, he had never once asked for my opinion on how to handle a threat of this scale. I thought carefully before answering, remembering everything I had learned about the different factions, their customs, their pride, the specific ways each of them valued honesty and exposure over quiet, private confrontation. I told him that if Mara believed her deception was still secure, the most dangerous thing we could do was confront her privately, giving her the chance to either flee or trigger whatever plan she had prepared as a fallback. I suggested instead that the truth needed to come out publicly, in front of the entire summit, in a way that left her no room to spin the story differently to each faction separately, the way I suspected she might have been planning to do all along, turning one group against another, using carefully placed lies suited to each audience. Vorin studied me for a long moment, something unreadable in his expression, before finally nodding slowly. He said that meant everything would come down to how the truth was delivered, and to whom, and in what order, and that this was exactly the kind of moment my particular skills had been built for, whether either of us had realized it back in that cargo bay or not. We returned to the summit room a few minutes later. The recess officially ended, 5 factions once again seated around the wide circular table, unaware that the ground beneath their careful negotiations was about to shift in a way none of them had prepared for. Mara sat quietly among the lower ring delegation, her expression calm, giving no indication that she suspected anything had changed in the short time we had been away. I studied her face as I took my seat beside Vorin, searching for any crack in her composure, any sign that she knew what was coming. I found nothing, which told me she was either innocent of everything we suspected, or far better at hiding her intentions than anyone else I had encountered since stepping into this world of shifting loyalties and dangerous words. Vorin gave me a small, almost invisible nod as the negotiations resumed, a signal we had agreed on during the recess, telling me the moment had not yet arrived, that we would wait, watch, and choose our timing carefully before revealing what we had pieced together. The negotiations continued for nearly an hour after the recess, moving through the second debris field on the agenda, a stretch of wreckage claimed by both the Outer Ring settlements and the Insectoid Trading Collective, each side presenting old salvage rights documents that contradicted the other's claims almost entirely. I translated the arguments back and forth, careful to keep my voice level, though my attention kept drifting to Mara, watching for anything that might confirm what Vorin and I suspected. It was during a heated exchange between Ilvek Doss and the Outer Ring representative that I finally saw it. Mara leaned slightly toward the lower ring delegate seated beside her, and murmured something too quiet for the rest of the table to catch, but not too quiet for me. She used a phrase, brief and almost careless in the moment, that carried a small idiom, belonging specifically to a dialect spoken only in the deep outer settlements, far from the lower ring territory she claimed to represent. It was the kind of phrase someone would only know if they had spent real time among outer ring communities, not simply studied their trade language from a distance. I kept my expression neutral, continuing my translation duties without pause, but my mind was racing. The Outer Ring crew that had ambushed me in the corridor had come from those same deep settlements. If Mara had spent real time there, close enough to absorb their idioms into her casual speech, the connection was no longer a matter of coincidence or suspicion. It was becoming something closer to certainty. During the next brief pause in negotiations, while the insectoid representative consulted with his own advisors over a disputed clause, I found a moment to lean toward Vorin and repeat, quietly, in common trade, exactly what I had overheard. I kept my voice low enough that only he could hear me over the general murmur of the room, careful not to let my expression give anything away to the rest of the table. Vorin's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only outward sign that the information had landed the way I expected it to. He asked, just as quietly, whether I was certain of what I had heard, understanding as well as I did that an accusation made publicly and proven wrong would destroy his credibility far more thoroughly than saying nothing at all. I told him I was as certain as I could be without direct proof, but that the pattern now fit too precisely to be coincidence. The timing of Mara's arrival in the delegation, the quiet payments traced through Callum Reyes, and now this small, careless slip of language that only someone with real ties to the Outer Ring settlements would make. He was quiet for a long moment, weighing the risk, before finally telling me that we would wait for one more piece of confirmation before acting, something concrete enough that even if Mara denied everything, the rest of the table would have no reasonable choice but to believe us over her. I asked what kind of confirmation he had in mind. He told me to watch her hands during the next round of formal statements, explaining quietly that in his years of dealing with people who lied for a living, very few could control every part of their body at once. Words could be rehearsed. Expressions could be practiced, But small, unconscious habits, the way someone's fingers moved when they were nervous, often slipped through even the most carefully constructed disguise. I turned my attention to Mara's hands as the formal statements resumed, and it did not take long to notice what Voren had been hoping I would find. Whenever the conversation turned toward the outer ring settlements specifically, her fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the table, a small, almost invisible motion she likely did not even realize she was making, present only in those specific moments, and absent entirely during discussions of any other territory. It was not proof enough to convince a skeptical observer on its own, but combined with everything else, the idiom, the timing, the payments, it was enough for Voren. He gave me another small nod, this one different from before, sharper, more deliberate, and I understood that whatever moment we had been waiting for was about to arrive. Voren stood up so suddenly that his chair scraped hard against the floor, and every head at the table turned toward him at once. He announced, in common trade, that before negotiations continued any further, he wished to raise a matter of trust concerning the summit itself, something he believed every faction present had a right to hear, before another word of business was discussed. The room fell into a wary, uncertain silence, the kind that comes when powerful people sense a shift they have not yet been given the details of. I felt my pulse hammering, but I kept my hands steady, ready for what was coming. This was the moment we had prepared for during the recess, the moment I had suggested, and now that it had actually arrived, the weight of it felt heavier than I had expected. Voren turned to me and asked, formally, whether I was prepared to share what I had observed during the course of this summit, in the interest of transparency for every party present. It was theater, in a way, a performance for the benefit of the table, but the words themselves were entirely true. I stood, my legs less steady than I would have liked, and began speaking, first in common trade so the entire table could follow, then repeating key portions in each of the languages represented, so there could be no accusation later that I had shaded the truth differently for different ears. I explained, carefully and without exaggeration, the pattern we had traced. The quiet payments moving through Callum Reyes, now dead in a maintenance corridor 2 levels down, the outer ring crew that had attempted to remove me from Voren's side in the days before this summit, the small, careless phrase I had overheard from Mara, a piece of outer ring idiom that did not belong in the mouth of someone who had spent her life among lower ring settlements. The room erupted the moment I finished, voices rising in 5 different languages at once, accusations and demands tangled together in a chaos that would have been impossible to follow if I had not spent the last several days training myself to catch every thread at once. Ilvek Das rose to his feet, his 4 eyes fixed on Mara with open suspicion. The outer ring representative shouted something defensive, clearly worried about being implicated by association with a crew that shared his people's dialect. The insectoid trader's clicking speech rose in pitch, translating his own alarm into halting common trade before I could even begin to help him. Mara did not rise from her seat, and for a moment, I feared I had made a terrible mistake, that her calm stillness meant we had misjudged everything and were about to be proven wrong in front of every faction on the station that mattered. Then she smiled, thin and cold, and began speaking, not in the lower ring dialect she had used throughout the summit, but in flawless, native outer ring speech, dropping the disguise entirely now that there was nothing left to protect. She told the room, calmly, that she had indeed been placed within the lower ring delegation months earlier, sponsored by interests who preferred to remain unnamed even now, with the specific purpose of destabilizing this exact summit before it could produce any agreement that might bring lasting peace between the 5 factions. She said a lasting peace was bad for business, bad for the kind of profit that thrived on old grudges and unresolved territory disputes, and that removing Voren's translator had simply been the fastest way to ensure the summit collapsed into exactly this kind of chaos before real negotiations could conclude. I felt a chill settle over the room as her words landed, because she was not denying anything. She was confirming it, openly, without a trace of shame, as though the confession itself was simply another move in a game she still believed she controlled. Voren's voice cut through the rising noise, sharp and commanding, in a way I had not heard from him before. He asked Mara directly who had sponsored her placement, and what she hoped to gain by revealing herself so openly, now that her cover was already broken. She said the sponsors did not matter anymore, that her task had already succeeded the moment the room descended into open accusation and distrust, regardless of whatever happened to her personally, now that her purpose was known. She said true peace between these 5 factions had never been possible, only a fragile pause before old wounds reopened, and that today, in this very room, she had simply proven that truth for everyone to see. I understood, in that moment, exactly what she was trying to do. Her confession was not a surrender. It was one final move, an attempt to convince every faction at the table that trust between them was impossible, that the summit itself had been a doomed effort from the start, planting exactly the kind of despair and suspicion that would ensure no agreement could be reached, even now that her deception had been exposed. I looked at Vorin, and something in his expression told me he understood the same thing I did. This was the moment that would decide everything, not the exposure of Mara herself, but what happened in the room immediately after, whether the factions allowed her final words to poison whatever fragile trust remained, or whether something could still be salvaged from the wreckage of her plan. I stepped forward, before I had fully decided to, and asked the table for permission to speak, not as a translator this time, but as someone who had spent the last several days moving between every language and every custom represented in that room. Vorin gave a small nod, granting me the space to continue, and the rest of the table, still reeling from Mara's confession, fell into an uncertain silence that gave me just enough room to be heard. I told them, speaking slowly enough that my words could be understood before I needed to repeat them in each language, that Mara's plan had depended entirely on one assumption, that no single person in this room could speak honestly and directly to every faction at once, without distortion, without one group receiving a different version of events than another. I told them that assumption had already failed, because I was standing in front of them now, having translated every word of her confession identically into 5 languages, leaving no room for her to have shaped a different story for each group separately, the way I suspected her original plan had intended. I reminded them that the technology under dispute in this summit, the salvage scattered across 3 debris fields, existed because of a war none of them had chosen, fought by people who were no longer here to answer for the damage it had caused. I told them that the writer of the data core I had translated weeks earlier, an ordinary person who had lost everything to that same war, had left behind words describing exactly this kind of moment. Old grudges threatening to repeat themselves simply because no one in the room was willing to be the first to set them aside. I did not know, as I spoke, whether any of this would matter. I was not a diplomat. I was not trained in the careful art of negotiation, the way the representatives around that table were. I was simply a woman who had learned to listen closely to people different from herself, because survival had once depended on nothing more complicated than being understood by her neighbors. Ilvek Doss was the first to respond, his 4 eyes studying me with an expression I could not immediately read. He said slowly, in formal Doskari, that he had come to this summit prepared to distrust every other faction in the room, expecting exactly the kind of sabotage Mara had just openly admitted to attempting. He said hearing his own suspicions confirmed should have satisfied him, should have given him every reason to walk away from the table entirely. Instead, he said, watching a single translator refuse to let that sabotage succeed had convinced him that perhaps trust between factions was not as impossible as Mara wanted them to believe. One by one, the other representatives spoke, some hesitant, some still visibly angry, but none of them chose to abandon the table entirely. The outer ring representative, clearly eager to distance himself from Mara's actions, offered a formal apology on behalf of his people, insisting that whoever had sponsored her placement did not represent the true interests of his settlements. The insectoid trader, through careful, halting common trade, suggested that continuing the summit, despite Mara's interference, would itself be the strongest possible answer to her attempt at sabotage, a refusal to let one hidden enemy dictate the future of 5 separate peoples. Vorin's security detail moved quietly to detain Mara as the conversation continued around her, and she offered no resistance, her expression settling into something almost like resignation, as though she had genuinely believed her final confession would be enough to unravel everything, regardless of what happened to her personally afterward. The summit resumed within the hour, slower and more cautious than before, but it resumed. Over the following 2 days, the 5 factions worked through their disputes over the debris fields with a wariness that had not existed before Mara's exposure, but also with something that had not existed before either: a fragile, hard-won willingness to keep talking rather than walk away. By the time the final agreement was signed, dividing the salvage rights in a way that satisfied no one completely, but left no one entirely empty-handed either, I felt a kind of exhaustion I had never experienced during my years as a courier, deeper than anything physical, worn down not by the weight of crates, but by the weight of holding 5 different languages and 5 different sets of suspicion together, long enough for something like peace to take root. Vorin found me afterward, standing alone, near the same narrow window slit where he had told me his own story of survival days earlier. He did not say much at first, simply stood beside me, looking out at the same slow drift of station traffic I had watched so many times since this had all begun. He told me the summit's success would spread quickly across the station, and that every faction present would remember exactly who had stood between them and disaster, not with weapons, not with threats, but with nothing more than careful, honest words spoken in languages that were not originally her own. He said his offer from that first night in the cargo bay still stood, though it had changed shape somewhat over the days since. He was not simply offering payment for temporary work anymore. He was offering me a permanent place within his organization, not as hired help to be spent and replaced, but as something closer to a partner, someone whose judgment he had learned to trust in rooms where his own instincts alone would not have been enough. I thought about my mother, 2 levels down, still waiting for the message I had finally been able to send her once the summit concluded, still worried despite my reassurances that everything was fine. I thought about my old courier route, the familiar corridors, the simple, predictable weight of crates I understood completely. Nothing like the shifting, dangerous world of hidden agendas and half-spoken threats I had been pulled into. But I also thought about the data core, about my grandmother's careful handwriting, about the strange, unexpected purpose I had found in using something I had always considered ordinary: my ability to understand people different from myself, to hold 5 languages and 5 sets of pride and suspicion together long enough to prevent a war none of those people had wanted, whether they were willing to admit it or not. I told Vorin I needed time to think, that this was not a decision I could make standing at a window with the exhaustion of 5 days still heavy in my bones. He said he understood, and that unlike our first conversation in that cargo bay, this time the choice was genuinely mine to make, without guards blocking the door, without any pressure beyond his honest hope that I would choose to stay. The next morning, Delia found me in the small kitchen area, pouring the same bitter station tea that had become a strange kind of comfort over the past week. She sat across from me the way she had before the summit, direct and unbothered, and told me that word of what happened in that room had already reached every level of the station, spreading faster than any official announcement could have managed on its own. She said traitors who had never once looked twice at Vorin's organization were now asking about the translator who had exposed a saboteur in front of 5 hostile factions and held the peace together with nothing but careful words. She said my name, my actual name, not simply a description, was starting to circulate in places she had not expected so soon. I asked if that worried her. She considered the question seriously before answering, which was simply her way. She said, reputation cut both directions in this line of work. It made me valuable, which meant protection, resources, respect I would never have earned as an ordinary courier. But it also made me visible in a way that could attract exactly the kind of attention that had led to Callum Reyes's death and the ambush in the corridor. She said Vorin understood this better than most, and that whatever decision I made about his offer, he would need to think carefully about how to keep me safe, now that my usefulness was no longer a secret. Later that day, Peter Ashworth delivered a message that had arrived for me directly, the first time since my abduction that any communication had come addressed to me personally, rather than filtered through Vorin's people first. It was from Ilvek Doss, brief and formally worded in careful common trade, thanking me for my honesty during the summit and extending an invitation, not an order this time, to visit the Doskari trading post whenever I found it convenient, should I ever wish to expand my understanding of his people's customs beyond what I had already learned. I read the message twice, struck by how strange it felt to be treated with genuine respect by someone who had accused me of disloyalty only days earlier. I mentioned it to Voren that evening, half expecting him to discourage any contact with a traitor who had twice tried to hire me away from him. Instead, he told me the invitation was a good sign, that Ilvek Das was not a man who extended respect lightly, and that maintaining a relationship with him, independent of my work for Voren, would only strengthen my position going forward, regardless of what I ultimately decided about his offer. It was a strange kind of freedom, hearing him encourage something that could easily have threatened his own interests, and it told me more about the shape of the choice in front of me than almost anything else he had said since the summit ended. I spent the following 2 days walking through parts of the station I had not visited in years, letting myself think without the pressure of an immediate decision hanging over every conversation. I visited my mother, finally, in person, rather than through a hurried message, and sat with her in the small apartment where I had grown up, surrounded by the same worn furniture and faded photographs that had always meant home to me. She listened to an edited version of everything that happened, one that left out most of the danger and focused instead on the summit itself, on the strange, unexpected use my childhood habit of picking up languages had turned out to have. She did not seem surprised, not really. She reminded me that even as a small child, I had always been the one translating between neighbors at the market, negotiating small disputes over the price of vegetables, long before I understood what negotiation even meant. She said she had always suspected that skill would take me somewhere unexpected, though she admitted she had never imagined anywhere quite this dangerous. I asked her what she thought I should do. She told me, gently, that she could not make that choice for me, but that she had watched me come home over the years, feeling smaller and smaller after every shift as a courier, worn down by work that used none of what actually made me valuable. She said she had never seen me speak about anything the way I had just spoken about the summit, with something close to pride rather than simple exhaustion, and that this, more than any amount of money or danger, was probably worth paying attention to. I returned to Voren's ship 2 days later, my decision settling into place somewhere during the quiet walk back through corridors that had once felt entirely ordinary and now felt like the edge of an entirely different life. I found him in the same small meeting room where he had first shown me the data core, studying a fresh set of documents related to the aftermath of the summit. I told him I would stay, not simply as hired help, and not entirely on his terms either, but as something closer to what he had described that night by the window, a partner whose judgment mattered, whose choices about which meetings to attend and which risks to accept would be genuinely her own from this point forward. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly, and told me that arrangement suited him better than he had expected it to, given how differently our partnership had begun. I did not know, standing there, everything that would come from that decision, how many more rooms full of suspicious strangers I would eventually walk into, how many more languages I would eventually learn, simply because survival demanded it, the way it always had. But I knew, finally, that I had chosen this path myself, rather than having it forced upon me in a cargo bay with a dead man on the floor and guards blocking the only door out. That night, for the first time since this entire strange chapter of my life began, I slept without fear, tangled into every dream, and woke the next morning to the quiet, familiar hum of a ship that had somehow, against every expectation I once had for my own small, predictable life, become something close to home. Because a fat delivery woman, who once thought her only skill was carrying crates, had turned out to be exactly what a desperate man, and an entire station full of desperate strangers, had needed all along.